Hello everyone, today we talk about the Fatimid Caliphate, trying to give a broad introduction to the topic, and eventually we will make more detailed videos on it. So the Fatimids emerge from this Ismaili Islam of Middle Eastern origin, essentially, of intense communitary and missionary inspiration that took force from this political movement that at the beginning of the 10th century was fueling the ethnical and social contrasts internal to the Ifriqiya, right? So the North Africa, especially Tunisia and what would be today Eastern Algeria, right? So that's where fundamentally the Fatimids managed to overwhelm the Aghlabite dynasty that had developed in Tunisia, also occupying parts of Sicily at that point, and substituting to it, right, on the base of a alleged ancestry from Fatima and Ali, right, and disowning the legitimacy of the Abbasids of Baghdad. That's when basically they assumed the caliphal title and began their expansion east, actually. The Fatimid Caliphate's religious ideology originated in Salamiya in Syria. By the 8th century, Ismaili Imam Ahmad al-Wafi lived between 766 and 828. And Ahmad al-Wafi basically claimed descent through Ismail ibn Jafar, the 7th Ismaili Imam, right? So from Fatima, as we said, and her husband Ali, the first Shia Imam, actually, hence the name of the Fatimids, al-Fatimi, right? The Fatimid that originated from the same Ahmad al-Wafi, right? And so the other Ismaili Imams throughout the 9th century essentially remained hidden and worked for the movement against the Abbasid rulers of the period in Syria. Eventually, it's Abdullah al-Mahdī Billah lived between 873 and 934, together with his son, to make his way in the guise of a merchant to Sijili Masa, right? That is in today's Morocco, essentially, in order to flee the persecution by the Abbasid Caliph, right? Who found obviously the Ismaili beliefs as heretical and as well as a political threat. The Abbasid Caliphate, at this point, telling the truth, had, especially under al-Mamun, had swung a little bit. There was a moment in which potentially could even become a Shia power, right? But it wouldn't. And actually the Shiites remained this a minority in the Caliphate that, however, especially from Persia, was this kind of looming threat on the unity of universal of the universal caliphate, right? So to the unity of Islam in itself. And so there are naturally many legends surrounding the figure of Abdullah al-Mahdī Billah, because there was this legend according to which Abdullah and his son were fulfilling a prophecy that the Mahdi would this catalological redeemer of Islam, and according to these traditions, will appear and rule for 5, 7, 9, or 90 years before the year of judgment and the rid of evil, would come, in fact, from Mesopotamia, even though they had left from Syria, as we've seen, to Sili Maza in Morocco. This is just a tradition. And they hid, Abdullah and his son hid among the population of Sili Maza, that at the time was an independent emirate in Morocco, right? Ruled by Prince Yahya ibn Midrar. So here, basically to the opposite ends of the Islamic world, almost, at least very far on the not on the coast actually, but still on the Atlantic side of the Atlas, I believe. And so at this point, Abdullah al-Mahdi's control soon extended from his movement over all the Maghreb, right, in this area consisting of the modern countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, right. So this was a movement that began to spread within the local divisions and eventually took steam. At the point it was incontainable. And there is an expansion that is witnessed also by new forms of urbanism. For example, the Fatimid Caliphate at this point was based on the newly built city of al-Mansuriya, named in honor of al-Mansur. There was near Cairo, incidentally, in Tunisia. It was basically the most important center at the time before the rise of Tunis, and from which the same Aghlabites had actually built their power and invaded Sicily, and so on. Right. So here begins properly the expansion eastwards after the overthrow of the Aghlabids, right? Because basically Fatimid expansion overwhelmed everything in between the Atlantic Ocean and Egypt, right? The Fatimids penetrated in Palestine and in Syria up to Damascus, and they reached the control of the holy cities of Islam, of Medina and the Mecca. So in the core of in Western Arabia. So this expansion is very important, and it starts especially in 969 when the Fatimid general Jawar the Sicilian conquered Egypt. So big shot, because Egypt naturally was one the most important center in North Africa with the Nile, all the agricultural resources. Now, this figure of Jawar the Sicilian is very interesting because he was basically a Fatimid general of Slavic origins, right? He was originally a slave of Slavic origins, that is, Slavic slaves. In fact, it's also the association of the name were usually to be found in Mediterranean, like being sold by the Italian centers sometimes, but also from other regions around the Mediterranean. And what is interesting is that in fact this slave was converted to Islam, and eventually he rose to power, at the point becoming one of the most prestigious generals. And it was normal, right? This is this phase in the Islamic world in which the ghulams also start basically appear and will become the bulk of the same Islamic forces, as it will be the case for Egypt, not under Fatimid rule, but also under the Ayyubids and the Mamluks, in fact, that are essentially the same dynasties of slaves that rose to power. And many of them actually were of European origin, like in this case. And the Caesar of Egypt is this big shot. In the history of North African Islam, there are these frequent episodes, starting from the same invasion of Spain, for example, back in the day, that had occurred thanks to the manpower that had been provided by this essentially tribal Berber populations that, under the guidance of Arab commanders would provide the sufficient strength to repeatedly invade certain areas here. And this all goes with a very complex system of trade and slavery, and of these new opportunities of this sometimes even semi-nomadic powers that had enough steam exactly because they were essentially gravitating around more, let's say, wealthier, more developed powers, sedentary powers with solid agriculture systems, urbanizations, etc., that they always, of course, wanted to invade, to conquer. And this is the case of the Fatimids as well, right? That fundamentally started their manpower on the base of the Kutama Berber tribesmen, that is this major Berber tribe in the north of Algeria that is classified among the Berber Confederation of the Bavars, right? And though it's witnessed much earlier, even by the Hellenic geographer Ptolemy. So these were essentially warlike communities that, as we were saying before, were always hunting for loot and prey, and could fuel this very peculiar area of Islam. This the armies of all these various movements that could raise from a moment to another. This is kind of a typical characteristic of the Islamic world throughout all the Middle Ages and even beyond. In the lack of a more centralized, those areas that didn't develop a centralized power. Since there is also, North Africa, the Maghreb in itself was considered from an Islamic perspective, and even from same Egypt and Syria and Mesopotamia, and Persia, of course, in Arabia, this broader Islamic world that was close in the sense to areas of, let's say, a millenary civilization and development, urbanization and culture and philosophy, etc. We'll see now what the Fatimids were able to do in Egypt and Syria, for example. That the Maghreb was considered always the land of the heretics, right? Of these movements that basically were fueled by a superficial Islamization, right? That was in fact normal, considering that aside from the major coastal centers of the Mediterranean, of Greek, Punic, or Roman origin, were semi-nomads. Were these barbaric tribes that might accept formally Islam, but that they coexisted, given their lifestyle and their passage and their social structures, with other beliefs that were largely pagan, in fact, right? So in the Islamic world, the magician, for example, the evil magician, its dark figures, come usually from the Maghreb. It's this kind of mysterious land that has several dark sides and ambivalences, and so on. And indeed, the Fatimid wave, in a certain sense, contributes to confirm a bit of this stereotype, because it was a wave that objectively, if you look at the rest of Islamic history in the area, it would never happen, right? Normally, the movements had been obviously from east to west, and not vice versa. But the Fatimids are able to put together this strengths, this moral as well as material forces, and making this very big, having this very big achievement of conquering Egypt, right? And from there, doing a lot of things, because as we were saying before, Egypt it was one of the most advanced lands in the area, and it was a much more solid base of power with certain statal traditions, unlike Western Africa was. So here, in Egypt, the Fatimids built near Fustat a new palace city, which was also called al-Mansuriya, in honor of al-Mansur, and under al-Mu'izz Din Allah, the Fatimids conquered also the Ishtid Vilaya, which was this dynasty that ruled Egypt between 935 to 969. It had been established by Muhammad ibn Tughi al-Ikhshid, hence the name Ikhshidid. There was a Turkic slave soldier, right? So this was appointed as governor by the Abbasid Caliph himself, and in fact, this dynasty, albeit basically rebellious and ruling roughly this area that the Fatimids would occupy themselves. So basically, from Cyrenaica to the Bab el Mandeb Strait, from Sudan to Syria. So this enormous power that would essentially remain in history, the one of Fatimids, eventually of the Ayyubids, eventually of the Mamluks, and eventually of conquered by the Ottomans, but with a certain degree of autonomy, because it was indeed a pre-existing harbor of let's say of civilization, of culture, other communities. And this dynasty had the Ikhshidids had in fact kept the Arabic title Wali, that reflected their position as governors on behalf of the Abbasids, which was still a prestigious thing to do, right? Especially when you didn't have this different, essentially, religious views like the Fatimids instead did. This was the Ikhshidids were a Sunni dynasty, so their allegiance to the Abbasids was nevertheless important, because it still represented a form of legitimization for this power. And that's here that, very importantly from an historical point of view, the Fatimids found the new capital at al-Qahira, so Cairo, in 969. And the name of al-Qahira means essentially the vanquisher, the conqueror, and it refers nothing else but to the planet Mars, the subduer that rose in the sky at the time when the construction of the city started, right? And Cairo, it's very important to look at the founding of new cities in this context, because they're not just logistical basis. At this point, Cairo was intended as a royal enclosure for the Fatimid Caliphate and his army, but there was a much larger project attached to it, and the founding of new centers and the rise of new ones and the decline of others is typical also of other areas of, in this case, also Western Africa and the Islamic world in general. The same happened with Cairo and Tunis in Tunisia. But here we can find something similar. And in fact, Cairo was to rise as the actual administrative and economical capital of Egypt, although it was not the only one. This is also important to bear in mind. There is not a single capital. For example, Fustat maintained its capital importance until very late in time, until 1169. So basically the 2 years from the very end of the same Fatimid rule in Egypt. And after the conquest of Egypt, the Fatimids expand further in other directions, because they their power extended from Tunisia to Syria, as well as Sicily, right? And so this area is naturally very difficult to be kept together, but it has a strictly Mediterranean dimension, right? It's based unitly on sea trade, and these connections between areas, and especially in the Western Mediterranean, from the African side, are strongly related to trade traffics, because the interland is basically semi-desertic, and there can't be anything else. Basically, Tunisia and Morocco are the only areas that can sustain kind of a more sedentary base, even in the hinterland. The rest becomes difficult, aside from Egypt itself, of course, the Nile Valley. So at this point, the Fatimids started building their power that was very, very amazing for the time. They created bureaucracy that in compliance with the previous Islamic models. And the same Cairo, as an Egyptian capital, started to compete actually, and victoriously, under many points of view, with Baghdad itself, right? So the center of the Caliphate, of the major Orthodox power of Islam. And we're talking about here wealth and mecenatism and libraries, right? Under the Fatimids, there is a development of those encyclopedical studies that already previously had pulled together Shiism and the Hellenizing culture, and also in terms of commercial prosperity that was fueled by the relation with the coastal cities of Italy and through the control of the Red Sea with India. All right, so this is very important because, as you understand, there are usual geographical patterns in histories that obviously, if you control Egypt, you control a freaking lot of trade routes. You control the ones, in fact, from the Indian Ocean into the Mediterranean. You control, especially controlling all the rest of North Africa, like the Fatimids do for a while. You basically control all the trade routes between the Mediterranean and Black Africa, with all the ivory, gold and slaves exports that make an enormous profit. And consider that the Fatimids control also the western Arabic coast, so basically they absorb from Africa basically everything that can go through the Arabic Peninsula into Mesopotamia. So this took away also from the Abbasids of Baghdad a lot of resources, right, and made Fatimid Egypt a very competitive center, and especially a very dangerous rival for Sunni Orthodoxy, right? Because this was not like a power of all the others. The Fatimids were claiming caliphate for themselves, and in a Shia tradition, right? This is quite important. So unlike in other centers, the Fatimid state offices were kind of meritocratic, then based on heredity. Of course, there was a mix of both, but tendentially these were more centralized systems, especially in Egypt. And there was also a relative tolerance, right, towards other Islamic confessions and also other religions. For example, the same Sunnis were often appointed to government posts as much as the Shiites, which is particularly important because notably the majority of the Egyptian population didn't quite convert to Shiism. Like, Fatimid rule was, for those time standards, pretty good, at least up to a certain point before the decline. But the Fatimids never won over the overwhelmingly Sunni population from a cultural point of view. So, but the coexistence, as we see here, was possible. Many people say, the Fatimids eventually fell because they didn't win the local support. Yeah, well, it's maybe too pushed as an hypothesis. I think it's mostly the military system that will make the thing collapse. Or, I mean, the loss of control in the military system that was not locally based, but rather based on the mercenaries. And you can say, well, maybe the Egyptians didn't want to serve at that point, and the mercenaries took over. Well, the mercenaries basically took over all over the Islamic world at that point. So I don't know, frankly, from a strictly historical point of view, whether the lack of stronger Shia adherence within the Egyptian population actually caused the fall of the system. But in any case, the Fatimids were tolerant, even towards non-Muslims, such as Christians, Jews, and there is evidence also of other groups that were living in these periods, such as the Maltese Christians, for example, or the Copts specifically. And this is important because all of these confessions were fundamentally communities on their own. So it was not just a matter of religion, right? These were all Christians. Who cares? I mean, if you're a Muslim ruler, you should see them all alike. But it's not like that, because these are all different communities that have different interests, different areas with which they interact. And in a moment in which central power is not particularly developed in general, these high medieval times, all of these communities basically tend to form a balance to be used by the rulers to counterbalance each other and not to make one become too powerful. And in all of this, making the central power remain afloat, essentially. And Fatimid Egypt progressed, of course, and there were long-range connections also with the Christian world. For example, the Fatimid Caliphs' armies were filled with Mamluks. So there's slaves that were brought in from Circassia by Genoese merchants. Right, at this point, the Italians start to trade very, very intensely, especially with Egypt and Syria as well. Right, that at this point is in fact under Fatimid control. And of course, there were exceptions to this general attitude of tolerance, but this had to do mostly with local, the political balance of the moment rather than any actual religious orientation of sort. And especially Al-Hakim bi Amr Allah, that was the sixth Fatimid Caliph, is this very important figure in a number of Shia Ismaili religions, has been highly debated because he was considered, as among medieval Muslim historians, conflated with his role in the Druze faith, right? That is this kind of exoteric ethno-religious group originating in Western Asia. And all problems that now we can't go thoroughly in detail, but that have to do with that in part, according to me, reflect the chronic instability of certain areas of Muslim power. Always remember that Muslim political culture is very different from, for example, the Christian one, and that this idea that fundamentally every earthly ruler is suspected of being usurping divine authority on earth is sometimes was used as an effective excuse to rise arms, for example, against a ruler, for which every political and military chief at this time had to consider very, very thoroughly all of the options that were on the table, because a single failure could be interpreted as fundamentally the unfavor of God, and therefore someone else could take over. And this is how the same Fatimids had risen to power largely, and that's how Islamic powers self-justified themselves in their rise, right? The problem was maintaining, right? And the Shia were, in this sense, some of the most troubled. The Shia eventually, as you know, lost, broadly speaking, against the Orthodoxy, like especially with the Turkic slaves that took over as political and military power. They were all Sunni, right? They had passed fundamentally through the Abbasid filter, even though they had initially settled in Persia. They were, in the sense, exposed also to other Shia influences. However, looking at the role of the Fatimids here, you can look at the enormous size of this caliphate, right? At least at the height of his power. Egypt now had become properly the center of the caliphate, of the empire, right? It was the wealthiest area, the one on which you could base more political and military power, a centralized administration of some sort. So eventually, at this point, the Fatimids were still ruling on Western Africa, but the empire had reached now very broad dimensions. So we have seen there were parts of North Africa being controlled from Egypt and Sicily and Palestine and Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the Red Coast of Africa, Tihama, so this this Red Sea coastal plain of the Arabian Peninsula from the Gulf of Aqaba to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Hejaz, so this region in today's West Saudi Arabia, and that represents basically the interland. It's where Islam had first spread from, and that's why it's distinguished from the Tiamat. It is basically the western region considered, and this is the interland, but also Yemen, right? So areas of Yemen that had been historically some of the most advanced in Arabia had very advanced civilizations back in the day, very intense relations always with all these great of the civilizations of the Mesopotamian, Egypt, and Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean, etc. So, and what is interesting about these powers is that being founded properly on a religious movement, in the Sharia strictly meant, they permeated sometimes in other regions were far away, right, that at that point could claim for local political interest to say, okay, we are part now of that caliphate, because this is a caliphate, which means a universal empire, right? It's this idea, after all, that is part also of the Christian West. I mean, there is a universal empire, and that has that is somewhat a matter of how it has to be applied on earth, but there is this ideal that is always there, and that there is only one empire, right? Which becomes critical, because at this point you have, of course, the Abbasid Caliphate based on basically on Mesopotamia, and this other caliphate in Egypt. You have the Caliphate of Cordoba, that is also perceiving itself as a caliphate on its own. That is the ancient Umayyad one, overthrown in the Middle East by the Abbasids, and it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantines in Europe, in Christian Europe. So universalism is very important, and sometimes it could be in fact embraced in terms of political allegiance by other powers that even in plain Islam were felt more from this strictly religious perspective than, for example, in Christianity, right? Because what happens in here is that Multan is that this is the city in the Punjab province of Pakistan today. It's one of the oldest cities in South Asia, by the way. It basically decides, so Pakistan is pretty far away in this sense, to be part of the Fatimid Caliphate. It's hundreds and hundreds of miles away in a completely different region, and it says we are part of it, right? So it's this cultural connections that have to do, of course, also with trade and other contexts that existed, and that all reconnect to Egypt that flourishes in this sense. It is able to maintain this net with this through this extensive Fatimid network, both in Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, right? The Fatimids arrive through their trade and diplomatic ties up to Song, China, right? And this is very meaningful. So the Fatimids start occupying as this major now trade power in the Indian Ocean, with its markedly maritime dimension. Also the Muslim world through the Indian Ocean up to the far east of Asia, right, up to China. And here it was plenty of activities, and Islam was spreading, by the way, into the far east, southeast, more than else, with powers that were structuring themselves locally on the base of Islam, or what, with all the commixtions that of course existed with local paganism, but that revolve much around this sea trade, right? And there were also different types of land exploitation. For example, the Fatimid focus on agriculture further increased their riches and allowed the dynasty and the Egyptians to prosper. And there was this use even of cash crops, and the propagation of the flax trade that allowed the Fatimids to import other items from other parts of the world. The Fatimids also had this system that was shared by other Muslim powers, the Iqta system, that was a sort of tax farming system slash practice that it's similar. It's a quasi-feudal system essentially, but it's very different from the European one, and it's somehow more similar in certain areas of Islam and even the Byzantine Empire as forms of a more a tighter grip, let's say, on the local local land, right? Because this is these are farms essentially that are entrusted by the government to someone. They're not hereditary in theory, and also differently from a free settlement, who occupies the land can be substantially can be, let's say, controlled even in his personal life and choices by the landowner, right? At a point that this increases the local the control of the local production, etc. Although this system somewhat ate into Fatimid central authority on the long run, because especially in the on the further ends of the empire, this this land owning favored a sort of semi-independency of the local rulers. Well, we can say that it reflected pretty advanced administrative systems that in fact cared a lot on agricultural production, especially in the Nile Valley, where of course you understand what was at stake in terms of the soils production for an empire this size. So you're understanding here a very developed system that also saw the rise of this other of the cities that we were talking about before, and thinking about the great palaces of the Fatimid Caliphs in this vast and lavish palace complex built in the late 10th century Cairo in Egypt, where the Fatimid Caliphs had their households and the administration of their state. So there were imposing structures, and there are two main palace complexes, actually, the Eastern and Western Palace, and they are located in the center of the walled city of Cairo. Around the area is in fact still known today as Bain al-Kasrain, so between the two palaces, in fact. And this was a pretty imposing system that reflects the necessity of an administration, at the same time of controlling it through military means, because naturally these lands were at this point very, more difficult to control than the one in the West, at least in theory, meaning that in the West, as long as you had the favor of local tribes, you could effectively control much of these areas. But Egypt as a whole and all its dependencies were naturally a much more complex system, so there were more things could go wrong. In fact, even the need of walling the centers is pretty meaningful, right? Because they're sort of citadels and fortresses that appear in here. At a point, however, decline begins, also for the Fatimids. What were the roots of this? Well, you can say that the Ismaili Shiism that had identified itself at this point with the powerful Fatimid dynasty in the ruled countries remained in them, in the same Fatimids, like devoid of the morally revolutionary impulse that had originally distinguished it from the rest of Islam, right? Especially in its missionary phases. the success of Shiism in North Africa, for example, had been great, right? You know, the Shia missions penetrated deeply into the local populations and contributed to expand the same Islam, aside from its, let's say, confession forward. And but on the long run, it's especially the military that starts becoming a real problem in its management and political control. So, as we have seen before, the Fatimid military had been based on the largely on the Kutama Berber tribesmen that were brought from Western Africa on the march to Egypt, and they had remained an important part of the military even after Tunisia began to break away, as we will see now in a while. And these forces were progressively cited by local Egyptians that naturally formed at least the numerical bulk of this Fatimid armies as local militias, right? But also there was this contact between Fatimid Egypt and other North African regions, right? So other soldiers from Algeria and Egypt, and also from the eastern north, right? And that became, like the Turkic elements that were pouring, in fact, into the Abbasid forces as the major element of the army. And the main change in the Fatimid military had occurred during the latter half of the 10th century, where the Fatimid caliphs decided to push into Syria. And at this point, they needed to confrontate the Abbasid Caliphate directly, that was already dominated by these Turkish forces. And the Fatimids realized that their military is not updated, right? There is the need to incorporate these large numbers of Turks and later also of black Africans, right? There were many other let's say ethnicities. For example, there were a lot of Armenians that were basically all over here during in the area, and as a result, and so these were military professionals, by the way. We have seen that was this flourishing trade of slaves that were to become effectively soldiers. When you talk about slavery in Islam at this point, you can find several things like not all slaves were meant as people that were exploited just for work, etc. The slave could become fundamentally a client, right? So being juridically dependent from its owner, but still its owner having to give him something back in terms of, in this sense, of equipment, for example, or land. And this is the same process that, and through essentially a military function of the same slavery. Like these troops were meant to fight. They were trained as soldiers, and were also, in fact, sold as mercenaries. And their power would consistently increase because these mercenaries are fundamentally now the strongest side of the army. They are military professionals. They are not like the local militias. So once you acquire power in these ferocious struggles that happen in the Muslim world, you can't get rid of them, because these guys have secured power for you, and now they theoretically, you can't get rid of them so easily, because they want to remain where they arrived, even if they are theoretically under you, but they can overthrow you as well, and this happens all the time. And it will happen for Fatimids as well. What also starts happening is that there are factions that start appearing within the same military. They have their own political orientation that reflects the fact that they are already fundamentally emancipated as fundamentally armies on their own that are very difficultly controllable by the local rulers. And these divisions were fueled, by the way, by the ethnic differentiation of the troops, right? Because the units of the army were generally separated along ethnic lines. The Berbers were usually the light cavalry and foot skirmishers, which was typical of North African warfare since ever they knew the horse. And while the Turks were this heavier element, like horse archers predominantly, and heavy cavalry, eventually known as the Mamluks, right? And then there were black Africans, Syrians, and Arabs, who instead generally fought as heavy infantry or foot archers. So this gives you also the degree, also probably military complexity of these systems, about which we know very few, telling you the truth. But this ethnic-based army system would create instability and rivalries between these various elements, right? While the ethnic-based Fatimid army was generally successful on the battlefield, it started to have a negative effect on the structure of the caliphate in itself. Especially the Berbers initially represented the traditional bulk of the army, right? Those who had the strongest sway over the political affairs. But it was the Turkish element that grew ever more powerful and began to challenge the traditional Berber establishment. And there was, especially in 1020, a very serious riot that was especially started by the black African troops who wanted to oppose the Berber-Turkic alliance that they had agreed against them. And in the 60s of the 11th century, there was a relative balance that, however, collapsed pretty soon, and basically bringing the armies to break free from caliphal control, causing this major unrest, and this was caused largely also by economical problems, like the drought and famine had extended in time at this point quite for a long time, and therefore the whole system was starting being shattered, and people started to fight over the control of resources. And there was a primary civil war between the Turks under Nasir al-Dawla ibn Hamdan and the black African troops, right? While the Berbers basically shifted alliance between the two sides according to convenience. The Turkish forces at one point seized most of Cairo city and hold the caliphate ransom, while instead the Berber troops and the remaining Sudanese forces began to roam the other parts of Egypt, so causing all of the problems you can imagine. And in 1072, the Fatimid Caliph Abu Tamim Mad al-Mustansir Billah recalls the General Badr al-Jamali, that was the governor of Acre, Palestine, right? And Badr al-Jamali led his troops into Egypt and managed to suppress the rebelling armies, and especially purging the Turks in the process. And this temporarily saved the caliphate, but Egypt was devastated at that point, and there was never an actual chance to regain enough power, right, to resist to the general decline. And it's at this point that Badr al-Jamali also was made vizier of the Fatimid Caliph, becoming the first of these so-called military viziers, right, who at that point would dominate late Fatimid politics. So this was basically a declaration of incapability of controlling local politics by the caliphs themselves with civil power. An army was needed, and naturally this army wasn't very interested much in the well-being of the whole system, rather in maintaining its own status and power and prestige. And there was, however, some interest in local politics, especially because from the side of the viziers themselves, who would try to act at that point more as caliphs and then their aides. There is, for example, the Yushi Mosque was built by the same Badr al-Jamali, and under the patronage of the Caliph al-Mahdī al-Mustansir Billah that we mentioned before. And this was built. This mosque was built on the Mokattam hills, basically the top of Cairo city, from which you could see all the rest. And this mosque was also known as a victory monument commemorating the same Vizier Badr's restoration of order for the Imam al-Mustansir. And so in Egypt happened something very similar to what had happened in the Abbasid Caliphate. It's basically that the local mercenaries would take over the state. The same exact process. And in the 1140s, the Berber Zirids started to exploit Egypt's crisis to detach themselves and declare their independence from the Fatimids. And they also make something very important from a religious point of view, that was to recognize the Sunni Abbasid Caliphates of Baghdad, right? So basically betraying Shia and adopting Sunnism as this fundamental orthodoxy of Islam in the name of the Abbasids. Now this was very convenient because basically, the Abbasids had no way they could reach Western Africa at this point. The Zirid dynasty ruled between a few decades, but it was basically around all this area of Tunis and Tripolitania and eastern Algeria, so a pretty large area, telling the truth. And the Fatimids reacted to this rebellion by launching a devastating Banu Hilal invasion of North Africa. And the Banu Hilal were a confederation of tribes of Arabia from the Hijaz and Najd regions of the Arabian Peninsula that were sent by the Fatimids into North Africa at this point. So there was a guided migration of this Arab tribal elements that evidently the Fatimids could control at this point, and that overwhelmed with their forces the Zirids. Now this is important because it shows you what things that had happened, even at the time of the migration era. This time you would think it's far away, but certain populations, especially of this North African and Arabian deserts, there are still those tribal peoples that are ready to seize the opportunity to invade wealthier sedentary communities once again, right? So it's not that Islam begins and there is no semi-nomad that will not do anything about it. These tribesmen largely kept living the way they had already been doing at the outskirts of these greater powers that fundamentally were quite tormented, as we've seen at this point, and therefore every crisis of theirs could be exploited, and these troops would serve often as themselves as mercenaries, right? Arabs were pretty prominent, as these were Not much, because these were Arabic dynasties that needed, maybe compatriots. These were essentially now Arabicized elites over populations of very different ethnic background compared to the Arabs, but still in need of this tribesmen as mercenaries, and hiring them with the wealth they had, and that those semi-nomads basically didn't have. So after about 1070, the Fatimid hold on the Levant coast and parts of Syria was challenged by the Turkic invasions of the Seljuks, also by the Crusaders. So basically, the Fatimid territory shrank until it consisted only of Egypt at one point. This is an important transition, right? So the Fatimid Caliphate lost relatively soon, one after the other, to the advantage of these emiral dynasties and of Berber tribal groups, all the regions west of Egypt, that instead kept resisting in some measure against the aggressions of the Muslim emirs of Syria and against the Christian crusaders, when up to the 12th century, when sometime before the Third Crusade, the Kurdish military commanders coming from Syria managed to overthrow them, right? And at this point, the Fatimids had also lost the Emirate of Sicily in this 30 Years' War by the Italo-Norman chieftain Roger I. Right, these are the Normans that are invading Sicily and that are in total control of the island by 1091. Right, many Muslims emigrate from Sicily; they come back to Tunisia, and the Normans established their rule in the area, at that point being actually the major power in the area, and eventually by the 12th century even extending their power over their control over certain areas of North Africa that basically become client states of the Normans, right? And the final stage, let's say, of the Fatimid history is in the 60s of the 12th century, when the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din and had his general Schwerpunkt seized Egypt from the vizier Shawar in 1169. Schwerpunkt died 2 months after taking power, and that's when rule passed to his nephew Salah ad-Din, right? Al-Nasir Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, who began thus the Ayyubid Sultanate of Egypt and Syria, right? And this is important because it's the moment in which the Ayyubids repristinate Sunni orthodoxy in Egypt, right? So giving birth to this rule that would last up to the 1260, that will be followed in turn by the Mamluk Sultanate, and therefore putting an end to an opportunity that had been the one of the Shia Islam to take over wide areas of the same Islam, and at that point fundamentally maintaining, maybe even trying to extend Shia as the majority branch of Islam, right? Let's remember that the Umayyads at this point do not exist anymore, but let's say that Muslim Spain was Sunni. Abbasid power was fundamentally between Iraq and parts of western Iran, but the majority of Persia was Shia, and there were important minorities, Shia minorities into Mesopotamia as well. Think about the assassins that we've also made a video about, the Nizarites, right? So it would have not been so difficult after all for Shia to take over. Just think if, for example, if Manzikert had not been won by the Seljuks, well, chances were that, especially with the arrival of the Crusaders, the Abbasid Caliphate in Mesopotamia might have been wiped out by the Westerners, and at that point, of course, probably the Fatimid rule would have been in deep crisis, but at the same time, Shia Islam would have remained a majority branch of Islam, because basically Persia would have been left out, Egypt, who knows, Spain couldn't do much of it, but basically wiping out the Seljuk rule in Mesopotamia, especially, well, Sunnism would have had a lot of problems that we can, the consequences of which we can only speculate on, but would have been massive change in history of mankind after all. So yeah, this is more or less what I wanted to tell you today about the Fatimids, that objectively represent a massive chapter in Islamic High Middle Ages, and were hell of a power that is often not recognized as such, right? And especially very interesting how they represented a very positive alternative to the Abbasid Caliphate at one point, and how they could put themselves into competition with other for taking the lead in Islam, right? And it would have been possible, it would have been feasible. This might have been possible even if, aside from the Fatimids, I mean, themselves. I mean, it's possible that Shia, for certain political balances, might have objectively become majority at one point, even in the within the Abbasid Caliphate themselves, but it didn't happen. And so anyhow, and so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, otherwise subscribe to my channel if you're interested into my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.